The human colony on planet Rixa had been a symbol of hope and progress. It was one of the most peaceful settlements in the galaxy, located in a lush, green valley, surrounded by towering mountains. The colony's buildings were clean and modern, and the people lived in harmony with nature. Scientists worked on groundbreaking technologies, farmers harvested bountiful crops, and families lived without fear. No one could have predicted what would happen next. One morning, the sky was unusually dark. The air felt heavy, like a storm was coming, but no one knew what it meant. The colony's defense system, which had been built to protect them from small threats, suddenly began to beep loudly, signaling an alarm. The people froze. Something was wrong. Then, the first explosion shook the ground beneath their feet. It was not a natural disaster or a mining accident. It was a weapon, a powerful weapon. Within seconds, the skies were filled with massive ships descending from above. They were unlike anything humanity had ever seen. They were enormous, with sharp edges and glowing lights, moving like dark shadows through the clouds. They looked like a nightmare, and they came without warning. At first, the colony tried to fight back. The soldiers rushed to their posts, trying to activate the defense shields. But it was useless. The alien fleet fired again, and the shields collapsed under the pressure of their advanced weaponry. The human fighters, barely out of their hangars, were no match for the alien ships. One by one, the ships were destroyed, their pilots never getting a chance to even engage in battle. On the ground, panic spread. The people of the colony ran through the streets, searching for shelter. But the air was thick with smoke and falling debris. There was nowhere to hide. Buildings crumbled and fires spread quickly. Families were torn apart as they tried to escape. The once peaceful colony was being torn apart in minutes, leaving no time for anyone to prepare. The invaders showed no mercy. They landed in the center of the colony, their massive boots shaking the ground as they marched forward. Armed with weapons that could melt steel, they began to destroy everything in their path. It was as though the very air around them burned with fury. The invaders didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their actions spoke for them. In the chaos, Commander Jackson, the leader of the colony's defense forces, made his way to the command center. He had been in charge of the defense systems, the last line of protection. But it was clear now that the invaders were too powerful. He reached the control room and found nothing but broken screens and flashing red lights. His heart sank as he realized the truth. The colony was doomed. There was no way they could stop this attack. Commander Jackson's mind raced. The defense systems were down. The people were fleeing, and the invaders had control of the air and ground. What could they possibly do? He grabbed his communicator, trying to reach any remaining soldiers or survivors, but the signal was lost. Everything was falling apart. The invaders moved through the city with cold precision, capturing anyone they found. Jackson watched helplessly from the command center as the invaders rounded up civilians. He saw families, old and young, being dragged away. Some tried to fight back, but it was hopeless. The aliens were too strong, their weapons too powerful, and with every passing minute, Jackson knew they were getting closer to the heart of the colony, the core, the very place that powered the colony's life support was their next target. If they destroyed it, the entire colony would die. As he stood in the command center, staring out the window at the destruction unfolding below, Jackson realized something even more terrifying. This wasn't just an attack on Rixa. This was personal. The invaders were sending a message, and it wasn't just a warning. It was a declaration of war. The dark ships above continued to rain down fire, and the colony's final moments came into focus. The people of Rixa, once so proud and confident, now cowered in fear. There was no one left to help them, no one to turn to. The invaders had come to destroy everything, and just when it seemed the colony had no hope left, something unexpected happened. In the midst of the destruction, a group of survivors began to regroup. They were not soldiers or warriors, but ordinary people who had survived the initial onslaught. They knew they were outmatched, but they refused to give up. Among them was Commander Jackson, who had one final thought: "We may be outnumbered, but we are not defeated yet." Little did the invaders know, the humans would not stay down forever. The tide had been turned, and what they had thought was a simple victory would become their greatest mistake. The chaos of the colony's destruction did not stop with the fall of its defenses. In the days that followed, as the smoke cleared and the fires smoldered, the invaders began to move deeper into the planet. They searched for anything of value, knowing that Rixa had long been a place of knowledge and advanced technology. But the one thing they underestimated was the resilience of the humans they had just crushed. Commander Jackson, though defeated, was not willing to let the invaders take everything. With a small group of survivors, he retreated into the forests surrounding the colony. They hid in caves and makeshift shelters, keeping low and out of sight. They had lost everything, yet they had gained something even more valuable: and determination. At first, the survivors were disoriented, confused about what to do next. The military had been wiped out, the colony's leadership was gone, and the planet seemed lost. But as Jackson led them through the forest, he noticed something that the invaders hadn't counted on. The survivors weren't broken. They were angry. They wanted to avenge their families, their friends, and their home. Among the survivors was a brilliant engineer named Lila, who had been working on advanced weapons technology for the colony's defense systems. When the attack began, she was in the laboratory, far from the chaos. By the time she emerged, the devastation had already taken place. Now, Leela and the others were left to pick up the pieces, and she had an idea. What if the colony's greatest weapon wasn't destroyed in the attack? What if, hidden in the underground vaults, there was something that could turn the tide? While the group hid in the forest, Jackson gathered everyone together. He told them there was no choice but to fight back. They couldn't let the aliens just take over. There had to be something they could use, something they could do. Leela's idea was simple. They had to find the vaults, the secret chambers buried beneath the colony's core. Inside, there were weapons, ancient technologies that could be activated and used against the invaders. The survivors set out on a dangerous journey to find the vaults. They traveled through forests and hills, keeping a low profile to avoid detection. The invaders, though confident in their victory, were still searching the planet. The survivors had to move quickly, but stealth was key. They had seen what the invaders could do, and they didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past by rushing in blindly. As they approached the entrance to the vaults, the air grew tense. No one knew what they would find inside. The vaults were old, hidden away for centuries, and most of the technology had long been forgotten. But there was hope, even if it was a faint one. What the humans needed was a miracle, and this might be their only chance. Leela worked quickly, hacking into the vault's security systems. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she typed, her fingers flying over the controls. Jackson stood watch, his hand on his weapon, ready for anything. The tension was unbearable. Each second felt like an eternity. And then, with a soft beep, the vault door opened, Inside was a room filled with ancient technology. It was beyond anything the humans had ever seen. Some of the weapons were sleek and compact, while others were massive, capable of destroying entire ships in a single shot. But there was one device in the back of the room that stood out. It was a massive gun-like structure, powered by an unknown energy source. Lila examined it closely, her eyes wide in disbelief. "This is it," she whispered, her voice shaky. "This is the weapon we need." The survivors quickly loaded the weapon onto their transport, and the group began their journey back to the heart of the colony. As they moved through the forest, they couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. They were still outnumbered, and the invaders were closing in. But this weapon might be the key to winning. However, unknown to them, the invaders were not as overconfident as they seemed. They had been monitoring the survivors' movements, tracking their every move. The aliens had underestimated the human spirit before, but they weren't making that mistake again. The aliens now knew that the humans were planning something, and they were ready for it. Back in the heart of the colony, the invaders were setting up their final assault. The plan was simple: crush any remaining resistance and finish what they started. They would destroy the human race once and for all. But as they moved forward, they still had no idea what was coming for them. The survivors, armed with the new weapon, were ready to face the invaders head-on. They knew the odds were still stacked against them, but there was no turning back now. The real fight was just beginning. The first miscalculation was theirs. The humans weren't just going to lie down and die. They were going to make the invaders regret ever stepping foot on Rixa. The survivors were no longer the frightened civilians who had scattered when the alien armada first landed on Rixa, with the ancient weapon in their possession. They were no longer just hiding, they were preparing to strike back. Their resolve had strengthened in the days since the attack, and now they were united by a single purpose: to take back what was lost and make the invaders pay for what they had done. Commander Jackson led the group with a quiet but fierce determination. Leela, the engineer, was already hard at work studying the weapon, analyzing its controls and trying to understand its full capabilities. The weapon was unlike anything humanity had ever seen. It was enormous, far more advanced than anything the colony had built, and it hummed with an eerie, unfamiliar energy. But despite the fear that lurked in her mind, Leela felt something else, a strange sense of hope. If this weapon could work, it could turn the tide of the war. It was humanity's last chance. But the group knew they were running out of time. The invaders weren't waiting. As the survivors prepared the weapon, the enemy fleet was advancing toward the heart of Rixa. The alien forces were spreading out, tightening their grip on the planet. It was clear they were ready for the final assault, the last step in their plan to wipe out the human race completely. As the weapon was loaded onto the transport vehicle, a quiet tension settled over the survivors. They knew that this was no ordinary weapon, it was their only hope. They had no idea how the invaders would react once they saw it in action. Would it work? Would it be enough to defeat the Armada? Or had they just unleashed another mistake, one that would doom them all? The group moved swiftly through the ruins of the colony, making their way toward the central command center. They had to reach it before the invaders did. It was their last chance to stop the aliens from destroying everything. Jackson's mind raced as he led the group, his eyes scanning every shadow, every corner. He had seen the enemy's strength firsthand, and he knew that this mission could either bring salvation or lead to certain death. They were only a small group, and the odds were heavily against them. But Jackson knew one thing for sure: The invaders had underestimated humanity once, and they would make that mistake again. As they neared the command center, Leela activated the weapon for the first time. The hum of the energy field filled the air, and the weapon began to glow with a blue, almost ethereal light. It was both beautiful and terrifying. They had no idea how much damage it could do, but the time for doubt was over. There was no turning back now. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet. A deep, rumbling sound filled the air. The invaders had arrived. The alien fleet appeared on the horizon, a dark line against the sky. Their ships hovered ominously, ready to descend and deliver the final blow. The survivors had mere moments to prepare. Jackson barked orders, and the group moved into position. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for revenge. With a deep breath, Leela aimed the weapon at the enemy fleet. The air around them seemed to grow thick with anticipation. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Everyone held their breath, waiting for the moment when the weapon would fire. And then, in a flash, the weapon unleashed its devastating power. A beam of brilliant blue energy shot from the weapon, streaking across the sky like a comet. It struck the first of the alien ships, and in an instant, the ship exploded in a flash of light. The blast was so powerful that it sent shockwaves through the ground, knocking the survivors off their feet. But they didn't stop. Leela quickly recalibrated the weapon, firing again and again, each shot landing with deadly precision. The alien ships, once so invincible, were now falling one by one. The invaders were thrown into chaos. They had never seen anything like this. The humans, once thought weak, were now proving themselves to be the true threat. The invaders, who had arrogantly believed they could wipe out the human race with ease, were beginning to realize the cost of their mistake. But even as the alien fleet was being decimated, the survivors knew this was just the beginning. The battle had only just started, and the full might of the alien armada had not yet been unleashed. The weapon was powerful, but it wasn't invincible. The invaders would learn from this defeat, and they would strike back harder. Jackson's heart pounded as he watched the chaos unfold. He could see the fear in the eyes of the invaders, the same fear that had once been in the eyes of his people. The humans weren't just fighting for survival anymore, they were fighting for their very existence. And this was only the first blow. The survivors pressed on, determined to make sure that the invaders' arrogance would cost them everything. They had turned the tide, but the war was far from over. The sky was darkening, but it wasn't just the coming of night that cast an eerie shadow over the survivors, it was the silence. After their surprising victory, the survivors had expected a lull in the battle, a moment to regroup, but the silence was unnatural. The alien fleet had retreated, yet the survivors knew that this was no time for celebration. The invaders weren't defeated. They were regrouping, preparing their counterattack. And in the distance, the ominous hum of their ships could already be heard, like the growl of a beast about to strike. Commander Jackson stood at the edge of the ruined colony, looking up at the dark clouds swirling overhead. The atmosphere felt charged with tension. In the distance, the first of the alien ships began to break through the clouds, massive and intimidating. But this time, they were not coming alone. The invaders had called in reinforcements in Armada, unlike anything the humans had ever seen. The ships were larger, darker, and more advanced. They were prepared for what had been a single, unexpected attack, and now they were coming for a final reckoning. "They're not retreating," Jackson muttered, his voice low and steady. "They're adapting. Lila, standing beside him, clenched. Her fists, the weapon they had used, had caused massive damage, but it hadn't destroyed the invaders. The fleet wasn't just coming back, they were coming back stronger. Their strategy was clear. They intended to wipe out every last survivor and crush any hope of resistance. "We've got to hit them hard and fast," Leela said, her voice filled with urgency. "This weapon won't be enough for a fight this big. We need to take out their command ship, cut off the head of the snake." The survivors gathered together, understanding the gravity of their situation. The invaders weren't just attacking, they were launching a full-scale invasion, a last-ditch effort to eradicate humanity once and for all. The odds were stacked higher than ever. But there was something the invaders still didn't understand. The humans, despite their losses, were not broken. They were stronger than ever, fueled by the fire of revenge. Jackson looked over his shoulder, seeing the makeshift army they had built, a group of survivors, engineers, soldiers, and civilians. They were ready to fight. The weapon was powerful, but it wasn't the only thing they had. They had something the invaders lacked: unity, and that was something that no fleet could destroy. The battle began the moment the invaders entered the atmosphere. The massive ships descended in perfect formation, their weapons ready to fire. The survivors launched everything they had, using the terrain to their advantage. The first few shots from the invaders ripped through the hills, but the humans held their ground. The survivors used guerrilla tactics, hiding among the ruins and striking with speed, making each shot count. But even with their new tactics, it wasn't enough. The invaders' ships were too powerful. Each blast they sent toward the humans' positions sent shockwaves through the land, and it wasn't long before the first of their makeshift barricades crumbled. The invaders were overwhelming them, pushing forward relentlessly. "We need that command ship," Jackson yelled, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Lila, can you get a clear shot?" Lila was already moving, her fingers flying over the controls. Of the ancient weapon, she was already aware of the stakes. If they didn't take down the alien command ship, the rest of the fleet would finish them off. This wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about fighting for the future of humanity. "Clear shot in 30 seconds, Lila called back. "Just keep them distracted." Jackson nodded and turned to the survivors. "Keep fighting. Do whatever it takes. We can't let them get any closer to the heart of the colony." The invaders advanced. Their soldiers, armed with advanced weapons, descended to the ground in pods, flooding the battlefield. The humans fought back with everything they had, but it was a losing battle. The enemy forces were too many, and the human resistance was slowly being pushed back. The ground was littered with debris and the bodies of the fallen. But in the midst of the chaos, the survivors held on. Leela finally had the weapon aimed at the command ship. It was massive, larger than anything that humans had ever seen. It hovered in the sky, its hull gleaming with an unnatural light. With a deep breath, Leela fired. The blue beam shot through the sky, a streak of light cutting through the darkness. It hit the command ship directly, causing it to shudder violently. The ship began to break apart, its massive form shaking as explosions rocked its surface. The invaders' most powerful ship was crumbling before their eyes. It was the turning point, but the victory was short. As the command ship fell, the remaining alien fleet went into a frenzy. They knew their mission was failing, and in a last-ditch effort to crush the resistance, they began to fire indiscriminately. The survivors scattered, trying to stay one step ahead of the overwhelming force. But Jackson didn't flinch. The tide had shifted. The invaders had made their first mistake. They had underestimated the human spirit, and now they were paying for it. The battle was far from over, but they had struck a serious blow. The invaders were no longer certain of their victory. The survivors, despite the odds, held on. Their enemy had learned a painful lesson. Humanity was not to be underestimated. And this was only the beginning. The battlefield was a landscape of devastation. The once thriving human colony was now reduced to rubble, a shadow of its former self. The invaders had landed in full force, and their fleet had ravaged everything in its path. Yet the survivors stood resolute. They had come to a point where retreat was no longer an option. This wasn't just about revenge. Anymore it was about survival. The future of humanity hung in the balance, and the only way to save it was to defeat the invaders once and for all. Commander Jackson stood at the front of the remaining human forces, surveying the battlefield. The alien armada still loomed in the sky, a monstrous presence that cast a shadow over the wreckage of the colony. Their numbers had thinned, but they were still overwhelming. The command ship had fallen, but the enemy wasn't retreating. Were regrouping for one final, devastating assault in the distance. The ground shook as more alien troops marched toward them, their weapons primed and ready. The survivors had lost too much. The weapon they'd used was powerful, but now it was spent. It had taken down the command ship, but it wasn't enough to halt the alien invasion. The humans were outgunned, outnumbered, and, for the first time since the conflict began, they were facing the cold reality that they might not survive this. But something was different now. The survivors were no longer the helpless civilians that had fled in panic months ago. They had fought and bled together. They had discovered a strength they never knew they had. And now, with everything on the line, they were ready to make the ultimate sacrifice to ensure humanity's survival. Remember what we're fighting for. Jackson called out to his troops. His voice was steady, but his eyes were filled with determination. This is it. We make our stand here. We don't give them any more ground. We end this now. Leela, standing beside him, nodded, though her face showed the strain of exhaustion. She had given everything to help them get this far, but now she wasn't just a scientist or engineer. She was a fighter. And like Jackson, she was ready to do whatever it took to save her people. The survivors gathered in their final defensive position. The last of their makeshift weapons were readied, but they knew that they couldn't win with firepower alone. It wasn't about strength anymore. It was about strategy, unity, and the sheer will to survive. As the alien troops advanced, the ground beneath their feet trembled. Their ships hovered menacingly above the colony, ready to obliterate anything in their path. But the humans had a plan. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't without risks, but it was their only chance. They had learned from their earlier mistakes and were ready to do what the invaders hadn't expected, use the terrain against them, using their own weaknesses to turn the tide in a coordinated strike. The survivors triggered explosive charges, hidden throughout the ruins, sending plumes of smoke and debris into the air. The explosion caught the alien forces off guard, forcing them to retreat for a moment, buying the humans time. But the invaders were quick to regroup. Now, Jackson shouted, and Leela pressed a button on the device she had been holding. The ground rumbled again as a secret weapona remnant from the colony's long-forgotten history was activated. It was a seismic generator buried beneath the surface, one of the last pieces of technology that humanity had once used to mine the planet. But this time, it wasn't for mining. It was a weapon designed to cause the ground itself to break apart. to create chaos and confusion in the enemy's ranks. The shockwaves rippled through the earth, splitting the ground open in massive cracks. The invaders, caught off guard by the violent tremors, scrambled to regain control. Their lines broke apart, their formation disintegrating in the face of nature itself turning against them. But the invaders were not without a response. As their forces adjusted, a new wave of reinforcements descended from the sky. The survivors, battered and bruised, were forced to fight on despite their exhaustion. The battle had reached its peak, and there was no turning back now. Jackson knew that this would be the final push. They had to hold out just a little longer. The seismic generator had caused confusion, but it wasn't enough to win the battle. The invaders' main forces were still advancing, their weapons ready to strike down the last of humanity. But the humans had one last trick up their sleeves. Leela, ever the resourceful engineer, had been working on a final, desperate plan, a single, high-powered shot from the remains of the ancient weapon they had discovered. The energy of the weapon was unstable, but if they could get it into the heart of the alien fleet, they could destroy the remaining ships in one blow. It was a long shot, and it might not work. But it was their only hope. Jackson and Lila moved swiftly through the ruins, dodging blasts from the enemy. They reached the ancient weapon, and Leela began to recalibrate it, her hands shaking with the pressure. She worked quickly, the countdown ticking in the back of her mind. The invaders were closing in, but she couldn't stop now. Finally, with a deep breath, Lila activated the weapon. A massive, blinding beam shot from the weapon, cutting through the sky like a streak of lightning. It collided with the alien fleet, and the explosion that followed was unlike anything the survivors had ever seen. The alien ships were torn apart in an instant, their hulls disintegrating in the blast. The shockwave sent a final tremor through the ground, sending the remaining invaders into retreat. The battlefield fell silent, the air thick with dust and smoke. The survivors, though battered and exhausted, stood victorious. The alien fleet had been destroyed, their hopes shattered. The humans had done the impossible. They had won, but as Jackson stood amidst the rubble, he knew that the cost of this victory had been high. They had lost so much, and there were still many unknowns ahead. But one thing was clear: humanity would survive. Against all odds, they had fought back, and they had secured their future. The final stand had been their most desperate hour. But it was also their greatest triumph.